Greetings, friends, and welcome to my guide on the Savage Burden of the Sun. This encounter has multiple phases, many one-shot mechanics, HP checks, and several healing and DPS checks. Overall, one badass fight. Depending on your class, I would recommend having at least 19k HP before attempting this encounter. This will allow more room for error and learning. Healers and casters can get away with less HP because of the increased magic defense. I will go into each of the mechanics as we make our way through the encounter. I will also try and incorporate as many different strategies as I can, but for the most part, I'll be focusing on the ones we learned as a group that best fit our playstyle and composition. Alright, let's get started. In Phase 1, you'll fight the Onslaughter. Here are its abilities. Its auto attacks are physical, while its cleave, hydrothermal missile, does high magic damage. All of its attacks will also remove stacks of final punishment. This will come into play later in the fight. There will also be ground AoEs that will go out. If you get hit by these, you will suffer massive damage and die. Just simply dodge these. Megabeam will target a random party member. This is a line AoE that will deal massive damage and push back everything in front of the Onslaughter. The width of the blast is similar to the distance between the legs. Execution. 4 black and gray squares will spawn, followed by a pentacle in the center shortly after. This is a DPS check. These pentacles must be killed within roughly 20 seconds or they will explode and wipe the raid. To kill them, each DPS must pick one, enter the square, and begin to attack it. Once attacked, the pentacle will tether itself to the person and apply a stack of colored Nissi, matching the pentacle. Only the tethered person can do damage to the pentacle, so it is very important that absolutely no AoEs of any kind hits them on accident, or the person assigned to the pentacle will not be able to deal any damage. It doesn't matter too much which DPS is assigned to each pentacle, but to keep it simple, we have our melee on the north 2 and our ranged on the south 2, so they don't have to move as much. During the execution, Onslaughter will do ground AoEs and Megabeam, so it is recommended to DPS the pentacle at max melee range on one side of the square. This makes dodging both mechanics a lot easier. If any tethered person leaves the square or dies, they will explode and wipe the raid. Perpetual Ray. This is a mechanic damaging ability dealing massive damage across 5 hits and requiring a tank swap after the first hit unless Hollowed Ground or Living Dead is used. You can use Holmgang and not swap, but the timing is extremely precise. The first hit is massive and applies a stack of vulnerability, forcing a tank swap. The next 3 do less damage than the first but come in succession. Then the last is a hydrothermal missile. It will take a few times seeing this ability to perfect it, and there are a lot of different strategies you can use to make it easy. For example, I time my Holmgang at the last second of the cast and take 3 or 4 of the 5 hits, then tank swap. This makes healing a joke. You can also just use Living Dead or Hollowed Ground on this one or the next one. All are equally effective. One thing to keep in mind though is that there are 2 perpetual rays in this phase, so base your cooldowns around that. Legislation and Discoid. Legislation will apply 10 stacks of final punishment spread across all 4 DPS in portions of 1, 2, 3, and 4. The stacks last 40 seconds. Shortly after, Discoid will go out. 5 orbs will tether themselves to players, 1 to each DPS and 1 to a healer. The goal is to completely remove all stacks of final punishment on all raid members and dissipate all orbs. To get rid of the final punishment stacks, you must take damage from the boss by either getting hit with hydrothermal missile or by running into orbs. When a player passes through an orb, a ground AoE will go out underneath it. If you stand in the AoE, you will take moderate damage and have a stack removed. The more people inside the AoE, the higher the damage will be. 1 or 2 players sharing the orb is fine, but 3 will likely result in death. You cannot grab your own orb or you will die. You can run into it if you have to, but don't stand in the AoE or else it will instantly kill you. The goal is to remove all final punishment stacks and dissipate all orbs. There are many strategies for handling this mechanic. I will be covering one of the easier ones. This strat also leaves room for error and allows you to recover if one or more people mess up orb grabbing. So basically, to remove stacks, you have to either get hit by the boss or take an orb. During the cast of Legislation and Discord, all DPS stack in front of the boss. During this time, use Adlo Deploy to shield everyone. After the stacks go out, have the person with 4 stacks get out of the stack group. Their job is to go collect 1, 2, 3, and the healer's orb. Onslaughter will then use Hydrothermal Missile. This cleave will remove 1 stack on every DPS hit, which should be 1, 2, and 3. After this cleave, there will be ground AoEs followed by a Megabeam. During this time, 3 should go grab 4's orb. Immediately after the beam is another Hydrothermal, so make sure that 2 and 3 are in front of the boss to get hit and have their stacks removed. You should virus at the end of Megabeam's animation because it will cover the Hydrothermal and the Perpetual Ray that is coming next. If done correctly, this should cleanse all stacks and dissipate all orbs. Onslaughter will then cast Perpetual Ray, which should be affected by Virus. The last hit will always be a Hydrothermal Missile, so if anyone has missed an orb or still has a stack, cast Succor or Adlo and stack in front during the Perpetual Ray to cleanse the last stack. Whew, okay, so that's a lot. I promise though, it is nowhere near as complicated as it sounds. Basically, it breaks down like this. 1. Take the first Hydro. 2. Take first and second Hydro. 3. Take first Hydro, take 4's orb, then stacks for second Hydro. 4. Takes 1, 2, 3, and healer's orb. Once you do it a few times, it will be very easy to understand. Doing this method also allows more room for error and it is less healing intensive. I would also recommend not focusing on damage at all in this phase while learning, because the Onslaughter has an extremely low HP pool and once you are comfortable with the fight and more geared, you may have to end up holding DPS anyway. One final thing to note, once Legislation and Discord are casted, even if you push the Onslaughter you will still have to complete both mechanics, so make sure that both mechanics are completed or near completion before pushing Onslaughter. After Legislation and Discord have been completed, and the Onslaughter is killed, this will transition you into Phase 2. In Phase 2, you will fight all of the robots from the Savage Cuff of the Father. Each one needs to be handled in a specific way that is similar to when you previously encountered them. They do less damage, but still have a hard-hitting brute force that is weaved in between auto attacks. The first 2 that will appear are Blaster and Brawler. The next 2 will be Swindler and Vortexer. Blaster will spawn directly north, and Brawler will spawn in the center of the room. Brawler will not move, but all of the other robots can be moved. Swindler will spawn to the direct east, and Vortexer to the south. Each one will need to be picked up by a tank and separated at different times throughout the encounter, dictated by which robot pulses the green wave. The green wave will buff any robot near the one that pulses. At first, Brawler will pulse the green wave, then once it dies, Swindler will begin to pulse. For Blaster, the beginning of this phase is a DPS check. Blaster must be killed within roughly 45 seconds. Otherwise, when Vortexer spawns, they will do auto clean and wipe the raid. After about 20 seconds or around 50%, Blaster will summon a Mirage and cast Mind Blast, so silence this. The other tank will either need to pick up Blaster or the Mirage to separate them. The Mirage will maintain all of its aggro from Blaster when summoned. If they are not separated, Blaster will become invulnerable, which will lead to a raid wipe. The Mirage has an increased crit chance, so use awareness when tanking it. The Mirage is also not affected by the green pulse, and will disappear when Blaster dies. For Brawler, it will be doing different attachment mechanics in addition to the green pulse. Make sure to call out which mechanic is coming up. For Party Stack, try and designate a spot you will move Blaster to if you move him. This will ensure everyone gets hit with the double buster. For Double Drill, make sure to assign who is baiting and where so no one gets clipped. For Single Laser, simply have the tank pointed away from everyone else. He will not do Single Drill until 50%. If you voke Blaster instead of the Mirage, make sure to keep it away from Brawler's Green Pulse, otherwise it will get a regen and a damage up stack. In handling this part, we move Blaster northeast, halfway in between where Blaster and Swindler spawn. This way we have a designated spot where everyone can be for the double buster. We have the tank on Brawler pick up the Mirage, while the Blaster tank moves east to pick up Swindler. Don't forget to silence the Mind Blast. Once Swindler is picked up, Blaster should be getting close to dead. You can use melee LB right when Blaster spawns at the beginning of the phase for progression's sake, or you can use it after Swindler does its height mechanic. Once this height mechanic resolves, Vortexer will spawn to the south. Blaster must be dead by this time, or they will do auto clean and wipe the raid. Swindler has a lot less HP than the other robots, but also retakes reduced damage. Ignore DPSing Swindler for now. At this point, the Swindler tank should pick up Vortexer and keep both south. During this time, focus Brawler and get it to 50%. There will be heights and Brawler mechanics happening simultaneously, so be prepared for that. Once Brawler gets to 50%, it will put up a shield and orbs will begin to spawn and move towards the center. When inside the shield, Brawler will take severely reduced damage, so start DPS on Swindler and Vortexer. Try and keep both Swindler and Vortexer's HP percentage about the same and don't push either past 50%. I would recommend upon one of them hitting 60%, immediately switch to the other. Keeping their HP percentage controlled will come into play a bit later when pushing them. This will allow you to control when their mechanics happen. During this time, the tank on Brawler will have to manage orbs the same way as before. There will be 2 raid damaging orbs and 2 green tank orbs. The raid damaging orbs should always spawn in the cardinal directions, while the green tank orbs spawn at intermediate directions. Stagger the explosions of the raid damaging orbs like before, and be careful when detonating the green ones. Precise healing is key here, and raid damage has the potential to be extremely high if a raid orb is paired with Party Stack, so be prepared for this. After all orbs are dissipated, Brawler's shield will go down. Around this time, Vortexer and Swindler's HP should be around 60%, so switch back to Brawler. Kill Brawler as soon as possible. Now after Brawler dies, you have a choice to push Swindler or Vortexer first. Ultimately, it shouldn't matter as long as you push one, wait for the heal, then push the other. At 50%, Vortexer will cast Super Cyclone and Swindler will cast Bioarithmetics. So if you decide to push Vortexer first, wait for the heal after Super Cyclone, then immediately push Swindler, or vice versa. Depending on DPS, it will be safer to push Swindler first because of the height mechanic. If you push Vortexer at a bad time, then get height, it will likely wipe the raid in a very humorous way. But you can always wait for the height mechanic if needed, then push Vortexer. If you decide to push Swindler first, sometimes you will get in this weird spot where Vortexer will be using Brute Force and will delay his Super Cyclone, which will line up badly on heights with stacks. Each group will find the benefits of both strategies, but the most important thing to remember is to push them in succession immediately following the 50% mechanic, and to aim for no more than 3 heights from when Swindler spawns before the push. The main reason for pushing both at the correct time is because of the lightning pass and heights with stacks. When Vortexer is pushed, a lightning debuff will go out identical to the previous one, as well as sludge AoEs. When Swindler is pushed, every height will be accompanied with a stack. If you don't push them in succession, this will mess up the timing of these mechanics, creating a situation where heights with stacks will happen simultaneously with lightning, instead of one after the other. Trying to do these 2 mechanics at once is really stupid and should be avoided if possible. You will need 2 different stat groups and a designated lightning pass. Stacks will always be on a tank and lightning will always be on a DPS, so you can either pass it to a ranged or the tank depending on how you want to pass it. Our stack priority for group 1 is tank, melee, melee, ranged. For Group 2, it is tank, healer, healer, ranged. Ideally, you want to see only one lightning and one heights with stacks. Try and bait the fire sludge either against a wall or all in one spot. This will leave plenty of room to deal with the lightning mechanic and heights with stacks. One final thing about this phase, and probably the most important, Swindler and Vortexer have to die within 5 seconds of each other. Once one of them dies, the other will cast self-destruct and wipe the raid if the cast finishes, so be sure to control your DPS and kill them simultaneously. Once you complete A6 again, this will transition you into Phase 3. Okay, Brute Justice. BJ is a badass with a pretty simple yet punishing rotation. The first thing Brute Justice will do is Transformation. This damages the whole raid and hits pretty hard, as well as knocking back, so stack up and mitigate this properly. The damage is not proximity based, so feel free to stack wherever. Just remember, there will be a knockback. BJ has an extremely strict rotation and does not deviate from it. I'll list the rotation in the description below. The first ability will be Flamethrower. This is a high damaging magical cleave, followed by Double Rocket Punch. Have both tanks use a cooldown and split this extremely high damaging attack. The area this ability hits is much like Hydrothermal Missile, where it is a small AoE around the target. You can take this solo, but isn't recommended or necessary. Prey, stack, and AoEs will go out, followed by another Flamethrower. 2 Preys will target random players, and both need to be taken away from everyone else, while one person is targeted with a stack mechanic, and others are targeted with ground AoEs. All of this happens simultaneously and can be a bit overwhelming, but it is pretty simple once you see it a couple times. For the stack group, simply be stacked on the east, then when AoE and Preys go out, dodge south. Another set of AoEs will go out, now dodge west. The tank will be doing something similar, except on the opposite side, keeping the boss faced away from the group because of the flamethrower that goes out here. The group and tank will meet up west to share the stack, and then immediately dodge north when the AoEs disappear. This will make sure you are not hit with the upcoming Megabeam. For the Preys, simply have one go east and one go south. The Prey that goes south should either follow the stack group at a safe distance or wait south and see where the Megabeam is pointed. This will make dodging the Megabeam easier. If you're going to follow the stack group, make sure you are roughly 10 yalms away from the stack to not hit anyone else. It is also very important for the Prey targets to not go too far out because of the super jump that follows the Megabeam. The super jump target is locked in as the animation of Megabeam goes out, and it is very important that the super jump goes on the intended target. For super jump, you can have the tank or ranged bait. In my first group, the tank baits, but in my second group, our black mage does it. So I would try both and see which one works best for your group. Super jump does high AoE damage, applying knockback and stun on any one hit beyond the first target, so make sure whoever is baiting is topped up and somewhat away from the group. After the super jump, BJ will do Apocalyptic Ray. This ability hits everything in front of it for moderate damage and applying a stack of vulnerability per tick. Simply get behind him. One thing to note about this ability is that if you res when this is going off, you will still accumulate stacks of vulnerability, so be very careful if you're resing during this attack. After this, BJ's entire rotation will repeat, ending with super jump. After this second super jump, this will lead you into the first intermission, Robots on Ice 1. It is recommended to designate a stack point for this upcoming phase transition. We stack up on the west side to make sure everyone is topped up and ready for the upcoming mechanics. During this intermission, Brute Justice will split into multiple robots. Nothing will be targetable. This is all about doing mechanics correctly. If anyone dies during this phase, Brute Justice will gain a permanent stack of increased damage dealt, making some of its abilities unbearable. So it is extremely important that no one dies here. You'll also want different positions and stack points for the upcoming mechanics. So for instance, we take the double buster on the west side of Onslaughter, then dodge the Megabeam and Chakrams by going through the Onslaughter to the east, or we dodge south, whichever is safer. For the Ice and Fire Sludge, we use assigned clock positions to make dodging easy. This way we aren't tripping over each other, avoiding mechanics. The first thing BJ will do is J-Kick. This ability hits really hard and should be mitigated heavily. Similar to Transform, stack up and prepare for this ability. This is followed by Blaster Dives and 100 Megaton Shock, which is proximity based, so be sure to be up against a wall to minimize damage. The dives are really easy. Simply bait them out, then back to the group to make sure they dive along the wall. This is then followed by a double buster from Brawler that needs to be split between the party. As the animation is happening, Chakrams will spawn on the outside of the arena. They will always be in pairs on adjacent walls, so this makes dodging them a bit easier than it originally seems. Ideally, what you want to do is as you're running to the stack point for Brawler's double buster, watch where the Chakrams are at, and dodge the upcoming Megabeam from Onslaughter into another safe spot so you are not hit with the Chakram. The Chakrams do extremely high damage, usually resulting in death, if not avoided. Once the Chakrams are dodged, we go to our clock positions. Ice, Fire AoEs, and heights will all happen simultaneously. Make sure to spread out and not trap anyone. Everyone will need to be in the correct height as well as dodge a potential Megabeam from the Onslaughter. During all of this, Brawler also does a single buster on the main tank, so the main tank clock position should always be 6 o'clock or south, because that is the closest position to Brawler. You really don't want this thing firing through the middle of the arena. The Megabeam can also target the main tank here, so be prepared for that. Once all heights, AoEs, Megabeam, and single Brawler beam on the main tank go out, the first intermission is over, and this will transition you back into Brute Justice. He will transform again, but it will do no damage. His rotation is exactly the same as it was before. This is a good point to gauge your DPS. Ideally, you want to push him during the Apocalyptic Ray, and skip the second double rocket punch. If you have to, for progression's sake, melee LB to push him, or if you're really far behind, tank LB the second set of AoE, stack, and praise. Once Brute Justice reaches 0%, you will enter the second intermission, Robots on Ice 2. Brute Justice will split into different robots again. Just like before, it is extremely important that no one dies. If that happens, Wing Justice will gain a permanent stack of damage up, which will make the upcoming mechanics much harder. You'll want positions for this phase as well. You'll want a stack point for Megabeam and positions for single drill plus Mirage dives. We stack to the west for Megabeam and spread out to the south, west, and east walls for dives. You can use the east and west walls, but keep in mind that Brawler's single drill is proximity based, and since he is north, the farther south you can be, the better. The first thing that happens is J-Kick, so mitigate this the same as before. We stack west here to try and bait the Megabeam, while our tanks run north and south to bait the double drill from Brawler. Be aware that Megabeam may target one of the tanks, so be prepared for that. As the drill animation is happening, 4 mines will drop down, 2 red and 2 blue. The 2 blue mines will always be within the 4 inner squares, and the 2 red will always be on the outside. Have your tanks grab the blue after the damage from double drill. Megabeam will be firing about this time, and more Chakrams will spawn on the outside edges of the arena. Be mindful of them and prepare your dodges accordingly. Dives will go out around the time you're dodging the Megabeam, so get to your predetermined locations as quickly as you can. As the dives land, another Megabeam will lock onto a random party member, so make sure when you dodge, you are moving to a safe chakram spot and turning for your correct dive if you are tethered. One strat is to stand in the line of the chakram, then when the dives land, move to your safe spot. This will make sure if you are targeted with Megabeam, the blast will go through the danger zone to free up even more space. As the Megabeam blast and chakrams resolve, the dives will follow shortly after. Once this happens, get to the east side of the Onslaughter. Vortexer will be casting Ultra Flash, and you will need to use the legs of the Onslaughter to LOS this ability. Stacks will go out as well, so you will need to designate which stack goes where. For us, we have the tank stack go behind the southmost leg, and the healer stack go behind the northmost leg. Once the stacks and Ultra Flash resolve, this will transition you into Wing Justice, Verdict, and Gavel mechanic. So the boss will transform again and begin to cast Justice. It will have 0 HP here, so save all of your offensive buffs for after the cast. Justice will increase and refill his HP completely. If you are using melee LB3 here, start the cast halfway through the Justice cast. This way, it will hit as soon as his HP refills. Wing Justice will cast a Verdict. This mechanic is extremely overwhelming at first, but is actually one of the easiest mechanics to complete successfully once you know what you need to do. Verdict will spawn a bunch of stuff on the field: 4 tornadoes, 2 pentacles, and 4 Nissi orbs. Verdict will also place debuffs on the entire raid. 2 DPS will always get a colored Nissi debuff and 1 final punishment stack. The other 2 will always get Roman numeral 3 and 2 final punishment stacks. 1 healer will get Roman numeral 1 and 3 stacks. The other healer will get Roman numeral 2 and 1 stack. Both tanks will get 4 final punishment stacks, and 1 will have minimum HP and the other will have maximum HP. The Roman numerals signify how many debuffs you must have after the Gavel cast finishes. The minimum and maximum HP signify the lowest and highest HP out of the whole raid. When Gavel resolves, everyone must have the correct amount of debuffs and health. The Roman numeral debuffs count themselves. The tornadoes that spawn will do 99% of your current HP, so don't be alarmed when this happens. It's supposed to. Whew, okay. Now that's a lot of stuff, but trust me, it's really simple. The pentacle debuffs. Kill the color coordinated pentacle, then share the Nissi orb with the healer closest to your pentacle. Roman numeral 1 will go on a healer. Player doesn't do anything except gather Nissi orbs. Take the first one by theirself, other 2 orbs with pentacle DPS after the pentacles are destroyed. Roman numeral 2, this will go on a healer. Takes the tornado, removes Nissi, and applies wind debuff. Roman numeral 3, both DPS take the tornado and final orb south after the Gavel cast. Tanks remove stacks by getting attacked. Highest HP tank tanks the boss during Gavel. Minimum HP tank grabs a tornado at the start of the cast. Now I know Gavel seems a bit overwhelming, but it is really easy once you see it a couple times. Just make sure people are topped when they have to take orbs, and make sure to not heal the minimum HP tank until after Gavel. Once Gavel has resolved, the boss will do a couple more auto attacks, then jump away. When it comes back, it will do another J kick, so be prepared and mitigate this properly. This will transition you into the final phase. At the start of this phase, Wing Justice will cast Link Up, which puts a water debuff on a random DPS. There are 2 different ways to handle the water debuff. You sack the target or split the damage and deal with the tornado. I will be covering the sack strat, because in my opinion, it results in higher raid DPS, it is less healing intensive, and it is more safe. Sacrificing also eliminates 2 mechanics at once, but I will be going over that in a bit. Shortly after link up, Winged Justice will do Final Punch. This is a mechanic damaging single target ability dealing massive damage and should be heavily mitigated. Final Punch will also knock back and bind the tank. Winged Justice will follow it up with slightly different versions of Apocalyptic Ray and a Megabeam. The Apocalyptic Ray will do ticks of moderate damage but not apply vulnerability up stacks, and the Megabeam can be split or taken solo with heavy mitigation. The Final Punch mechanic will always include Final Punch, Apocalyptic Ray, and Megabeam. Final Punch can be handled in many different ways depending on your tanking comp and what your group prefers. If you have a Dark Knight, you can have them take everything solo by popping all their defensive cooldowns and APOC. Then, on the second one in this phase, simply use Living Dead. If you have 2 warriors, you can have one warrior use all their cooldowns for the punch, then have the other warrior voke and bait out the Apocalyptic Ray to one side, then home gang the beam on the other side. There are a lot of different ways to handle this mechanic, all with their upsides. I would say talk about it between your tanks and healers and find out which method works best for you. I can say that sharing the Megabeam damage with the group should be avoided because of upcoming mechanics. It is a lot of unnecessary damage that can easily be avoided. After the Final Punch, multiple mechanics will happen at once. A blue mine will spawn on one of the 4 inner squares, 2 prays will go out, a split damage circle, Flamethrower, and 1 set of ground AoEs. Handle this very similar to the Brute Justice phase. The only difference will be that the blue mine will dictate your location. So because of this, you will want to be stacked behind the boss. This will give you the option of moving left or right depending on where the mine spawns. So once you see the mine, wait for the AoEs, then move in the proper direction. There will be a lot of damage here, so plan to mitigate this properly. The main tank will more than likely not be able to split the damage with the group because of the flamethrower that happens simultaneously here. After the stack, have the water afflicted DPS kill themselves on the blue mine. This will not only eliminate the water and tornado mechanic, but also the mine. Have a swift cast res ready. If you choose to not sack the water afflicted DPS, you will have to split a massive damaging crashing wave while doing Swindler stacks, as well as peeling off the boss for an extended amount of time due to the tornado. So for those reasons, I would recommend sacking the water afflicted DPS to the mine. During the flamethrower, it is very important that the main tank is looking for chakrams. They will spawn around this time. You'll probably have to move the boss, so everyone needs to move as a group with the main tank. A Swindler stack will go out here as well. Be prepared for this and have your tanks be 1 and 2, healers should be 3 and 4. This way, both tanks will always be a part of it and the healers will step in as needed. This will allow less movement for ranged and no mispositionals for melee DPS. This part is heavily dependent on the main tank moving the boss correctly, so be sure to focus and you'll get it. It is also everyone's responsibility here as well to know where the chakrams will be, so be sure you're looking. After Swindler stacks and chakrams resolved, Winged Justice will cast Megabeam on a random person. This one must be avoided, just like in the Brute Justice phase. Super Jump will follow immediately after this, so have your off tank bait this out to keep constant DPS on the boss. After the Super Jump, have the main tank face the boss away from the group because another flamethrower will be coming up, along with moderate raid damage and a final punch mechanic. The way you handle this one will depend on the way you handled the first one, so plan out cooldowns appropriately. One way to handle this is to Hollowed or Living Dead. A properly timed benediction here is amazing if you're using Living Dead. Another way would be to mitigate the punch, then bait out the ray on one side of the boss while Megabeam is on the other. All of these methods work extremely well, so see which works best for you and your group. After this final punch and a couple of auto attacks, Winged Justice will fly away, then come back down with a J kick. Mitigate this just like before. After the J kick, this is somewhat of a free loot phase. Winged Justice ain't messing around anymore. It's either you or him. If you have made it this far with little or no mistakes, the chance of you killing Winged Justice is extremely high. Winged Justice will begin to spin rapidly, creating a brutal, winged, savage, flaming tornado of justice that pulses justice waves. The first couple aren't bad, but as the pulses increase, so does the damage. Healing will become very intense, so DPS should be using their defensive abilities around the 5th pulse and should not use blood for blood after the 7th pulse. This last part is a straight burn, so go all out. Well guys, we made it. That's all I got. I hope this guide was helpful and will lead to some sweet first clears. Peace guys.